welcome back, everybody, to Pivot Point of View. I'm Destry Millsap along with Becky Pearson. And for those of you that are just joining us for the first time, I'm an athletic trainer. Becky is a physical therapist. And our mission is to get people out of pain and back to doing what they love. We don't believe that, anybody should have to be in pain their whole life. And I think a lot of us go through it and just think that, oh, it's a part of getting old and, this is what happens. And we don't accept that. We have a higher standard than that, and so does our guest today. And so today we're going to be talking about chronic pain and illness, and as it relates to stress and brain generated pain and illness. So, Dr. David Clarke, welcome. Dr. David is a renowned gastroenterologist from the Connecticut School of Medicine, and he's board certified in internal medicine and gastroenterology. He's the president for the Association for Treatment of Neuroplastic Symptoms, and his mission is to end the chronic pain epidemic, and it has become an epidemic. I know many people in my life deal with chronic pain and have been to the doctor multiple times and have come away with no answers. They don't know what's going on. They can't find anything wrong, and it just sends them into a tailspin. And so I'm really excited to have him on here. He is the author of 3 books, the producer of 3 films. He has a list of accolades a mile long. We are so lucky to have him on here. Dave, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much, Destry and Becky. I really appreciate the opportunity to bring these ideas to a new audience today. I'm looking forward to our conversation. But I have to point out your comment there about they can't find anything wrong. That's actually the title of my first book, so I have to point that out at least.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And man, it's so frustrating for people to have the medical system fail them in that way. And you hear these buzzwords of cortisol and vagus nerve, and but all of that had to start somewhere, and it had to start somewhere in our brain. So, what can you tell us about um, stress-related and brain-generated illnesses? What are some of the signs and symptoms that you typically have seen?
Yeah, it's the normal assumption that people have and a lot of healthcare professionals have is that if you've got pain or illness, there's got to be a disease or structural damage that's responsible for it. And that's, I was very traditionally trained. That's what I was taught to look for. If somebody's ill or in pain, we got to look for the organ that's responsible or a structural damage. But then if you don't find anything along those lines, a lot of healthcare professionals are kind of at a loss. What do we do next? And the assumption is, and the sort of the implied teaching, unfortunately, is that, well, if there's not a structural problem, an organ disease, that it must be all in your head, and that you're just somebody who's neurotic, you can't handle your own stress. The symptoms are largely imaginary. We can't diagnose you. We can't make you better. And it's really not our responsibility as healthcare professionals. And it turns out, that's what I learned the first 7 years of my formal training, but it turns out not a single one of those statements is true. In fact, for most of them, the exact opposite is the case. There's a whole other category of pain or illness that is generated by the brain. And because it's, the brain is full of nerves, we call it neuroplastic pain or neuroplastic symptoms. The plastic part is actually medical jargon for a capacity for change. And that's good news because it means that whatever these nerve changes are, they have the ability to change back to a healthy pattern if we know what we're doing when it comes to diagnosing the real problem and then treating it. And it turns out that, why would your brain do this to you? And the most common example I think most people are familiar with is phantom limb pain. Somebody's had an amputation, but they can still feel pain as if it was coming from the missing limb. What's doing that? Well, it's real pain, but it's generated by the brain. And the brain can do this in people who've never had an amputation. It can do it anywhere in your body from head to toe. It can be pain. It can be non-pain symptoms like, irritable bowel problems, diarrhea, constipation, lump in your throat, dizziness, trouble with your vision, all kinds of things. It's amazing the level of severity that the brain can get to. I've had patients with this for decades, patients in the hospital with this. It can be every bit as bad as any other form of illness. The cause of it is some kind of event, situation, stress, trauma in your life, some kind of challenge in your life that you might not fully recognize the magnitude of it. It was a shock to me that over half my patients with this, it's the stress started when they were children. There was something about their early life. Sometimes it was really obvious how bad it was, an alcoholic parent or some kind of abuse. But other times it was a lot more subtle than that. It was just, some parents meaning nothing but the best for their kids can generate a huge amount of pressure without even realizing it. And a lot of my patients came from environments like that. One of them said the only time his parents ever praised him or gave him support was when he did something better than his brothers and sisters could do it, and you wouldn't think that would be too big of a deal. And in my early years, I might have not paid sufficient attention to that. But when that's your life as a kid and your siblings are, very accomplished people, that it's really hard to do better than them, and so you don't get much in the way of being told you're a good kid. That can weigh on you, and it can have impacts on you well into your adult years. When I saw him, he was a 37-year-old attorney, and his body was just protesting left, right, and center. And it all traced back to just being made to feel like he wasn't good enough. So anything that happened to you as a kid, you would never want for a child of your own. I know Becky has two kids, and just, imagine one of them going through something bad, and you just have to watch. And that's something I ask my patients to do, is to imagine their own kid growing up in a tough environment. And you can't do anything but watch. What's that going to be like for you? And growing up in exactly the same environment you grew up in. That's a key test for a lot of my patients, is to think about that so they can get a more accurate idea of what things were really like for them. So the good news is, when we uncover these issues, we can help people with them, and uh, you can get better even if you've been ill for years, even if your symptoms are severe. So it's a hopeful message.
And we know, especially with the chronic patients that Becky and I treat, I mean, how many people come up to us and they're like, man, I've been having this pain for 3, 5, 10 years. And one of the most important things is taking a great history of this pain. And even going back into, like you said, their childhood and everything else, if there's something there that could help us figure out what the root cause is, that's why taking a very, very detailed history is so important. And when you treat somebody, especially with chronic pain, you can't just look at the area that is in pain. It has to be coming from somewhere that caused it, and so we look at the whole body and person as a whole when really treating anything, but especially chronic pain.
Yeah, and we weren't trained that way, were we? When we went through school, to become a trainer or a physical therapist or a physician, it wasn't like, something that was told to us that we needed to do. But when somebody's pain, if they injure themselves, okay, you've got pain from your injury, but that's going to heal, in a matter of a month or two, it's going to heal. But if the pain goes on beyond that, what's doing that? And most of the time, a chronic pain, the longer it lasts, the more likely it is to be generated by the brain. And they've seen this in scans. Somebody, for example, injures their back. They scan. They've done a study. This was in Chicago. They scanned their brains, and the parts of the brain that are active during that early phase of pain shift over time. If the pain goes on and doesn't heal, and the pain goes on to become chronic, goes on to last for, months or years, there's a different part of the brain involved. And the different part of the brain involves memory and emotions and learning and the making of meaning out of things, completely different part of the brain. And that's where we need to address. From a physical therapy or an athletic training standpoint, um, anytime you have somebody with pain or non-functioning limb, something that's, they're coming to see you about, that doesn't make perfect physiologic sense to you. When you're seeing somebody with a symptom and you're going, I'm not seeing damage here that would explain why you're still having pain. I'm not seeing that the exact symptoms you're experiencing make sense to me in terms of your of physiology and the musculoskeletal system. That's when we should be thinking about whether this might be coming from the brain, and start talking to people about what's happening in their life and what happened in the past. Very simple example in my practice that after a while, got a reputation for helping people out with sort of mysterious conditions, and they would send patients to me that did not have gastrointestinal problems, which was my specialty. And this gentleman had back pain for over 25 years, every single day, except when he was, except for 2 weeks out of the year. And you can guess what he was doing during those 2 weeks out of the year. He was on vacation and he had no pain then. So I didn't want to jump to conclusions about this being what we call neuroplastic or stress-related pain. So I said, well, are you lying on a warm beach somewhere, carefully resting your back, and that's why it doesn't have pain? And he said, oh no, I go fly fishing in British Columbia. And so he's out there in his waders, and he's twisting back and forth with the rod, and he's reaching down to net the fish. And I'm starting to get the idea that he's putting as much strain on his back doing that as he ever was back home. And then he tells me, just to clinch it, that when he's done fishing for the day, he helps the lodge owner clear brush from behind the lodge. Is his back hurting during any of this? Not a bit of it. He's fine. So that is not, as you both know, that is not structural back pain.
I think you bring up a really great point, a couple good points there. Like, I loved that you brought up, if you went through something that you wouldn't want to see your kids go through, that this could contribute, because I think a lot of us, it's how we grew up. So we don't know any differently. But how many times have we heard somebody say, I am going to be a better parent because, I don't want my kids to have to do XYZ. And so, I think that really puts a good frame of mind on some of the things that you maybe experienced as a child. Could that be contributing to your pain? And
Yeah,
then,
you're exactly right. I mean, none of us has a parallel life we can compare ourselves with. And a lot of my patients, when they look back, they'll say, well, yeah, I went through some stuff, but it wasn't that bad. I think I'm over it. Other people have been through worse. But when I ask them to imagine their own kids going through the same thing, completely different story.
yeah, 100%. And then I wonder how you get, but I just think about patients that have come in and maybe they do have mysterious um, symptoms, and they say, well, the doctor just said it's all in my head, and they kind of are a little offended by that.
They should be.
Yeah. How do you handle that person that comes to you and they think it's maybe a joke that they're sent to you because um it's in their head? Like, how do you handle that stigmatism that gets attached to that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a barrier because People, and I might include myself back in my early days, find it difficult to believe just how ill you can get and how much pain you can experience from your brain doing this. I mean, it's not part of what we learn as human beings, that your brain is capable of causing real symptoms that are every bit as severe as those caused by structural damage or organ disease. So I have to persuade people that if this is the source of their pain, that it is absolutely as real as anything else. One of my colleagues sent me by email a magazine article about two people who were suffering either from long COVID or chronic fatigue syndrome. They weren't quite sure which it was, but either way, they were severely debilitated. And these were people who had research backgrounds, so they were very highly educated. And what they said was, this can't be a mental problem. Our symptoms are severe, quote unquote. And that is just completely false. I could give you a list. I will give you a list. I mean, one of my patients had this for 79 years. And she came from a rural background herself. I mean, she grew up in the Rocky Mountains on a farm in Idaho. And you would think, beautiful setting. I mean, I've been through that area. You would think, what terrible thing could possibly go wrong out there that might be traumatic. And it absolutely, she suffered through a trauma when she was 8 years old, and she was still suffering from it at age 87 when she first came to my office. Another patient, 17-year-old girl, I was asked to see on her 70th day in the hospital. Looking through her records, she'd been in pain for 18 months. During that time, she had seen 6 other gastrointestinal specialists for her unexplained abdominal pain from 3 different institutions. And she was getting morphine around the clock. 5 or 10 milligrams would be enough of morphine would be enough to alleviate the pain of a fractured leg. She was getting 10 milligrams every single hour around the clock, I mean, for her pain. Um, Both of those patients, 100% stress-related symptoms. And I know this because they both were successfully treated with neuroplastic psychology.
How do you go about the referral? I mean, so people just you are now a teaching doctor. You're not really in practice so much. But if somebody says, okay, this might be me, like what's the next step? Where do they go from here? How do they get some help with this?
Yeah, there's a lot of resources now that I dearly wish I had had when I first started in this field. But at symptomatic.me is our website. And the first place to start is we have a 12-question quiz for assessing yourself and your own likelihood of whether this is going on in your body. And the more questions to which you answer yes out of the 12, the more likely it is that you have a neuroplastic condition. And each question comes with a line or two of explanation so that you have an understanding by the time you get to the end of why we're asking those questions and what they mean. Then there's all kinds of resources on there. There's if you support us by becoming a member, and we absolutely desperately need members so that we can continue to get this message out. There's a self-treatment course on there. We're going to upgrade that to a video course, we hope, later this year. There are recordings of our past scientific conferences, most of which are in jargon-free language. We've got some teaching courses for professionals, but those are jargon-free as well, so that the public with no medical background can understand them, even though they're aimed at professionals. They're aimed at both medical and mental health professionals. So to have those two groups understand the material, we had to take all the 5-syllable words out of it and make it accessible to everybody. There's a practitioner directory, people who've taken extra training to learn about this. They're all over the country, and many of them will see people via Zoom, like we're doing today. There are there's a curated list of books that people can read if you like to read. There's my book I mentioned earlier, They Can't Find Anything Wrong, but there's lots of others that are based in science. And then there's, this being the 21st century, there's an app. It was created by three people who had all suffered from neuroplastic symptoms. It's called Curable. They charge for it, but an annual subscription is about as much as a half hour of psychotherapy would cost. So very reasonable. And they've got, all the best ideas from me and my colleagues are in there. So that's a good resource. And the great news about all this is that there's tremendous hope. People who've suffered for years, decades, suffered severely, we can absolutely turn this around.
Dr. Clarke, you mentioned long COVID, and that was such a time that was high stress for everyone was COVID, and it seems like since then mental health has just taken a deep dive to the dark end. And and this chronic pain stuff can be so debilitating, just mentally more than physically, driving people to, commit suicide and hurt themselves even more just because they can't figure it out. Everyone telling them there's nothing wrong, all of this stuff. What trends have you seen since COVID?
Yeah, it's COVID was obviously a huge burden on the mental health of everybody in the country. I think it was probably the biggest burden on our youth, who missed out on school to a certain extent and, have had to try to catch up. And they're already, having to deal with being in the smartphone era where, it used to be it would take a while for some nasty rumor to spread around. Now it spreads to the entire school and overnight. And so they're having to somehow find a way to deal with that. And we know that anxiety and depression are up, particularly among the youth. But my message is that my patients who are suffering from this, whether they believe it in the moment or not, are actually mentally stronger than the average person. It's just that they're carrying a bigger load of stress by far than the average person. And on top of that, because none of us, again, has that parallel life we can compare ourselves with, they don't recognize the magnitude of the stress they're carrying around. I think of my patients like Olympic weightlifters, but they're being, because of how strong they are, but they're being asked to carry 50 pounds more than the world record for their weight class, and they don't know it. So if we can have a conversation and we can help people understand just how much they're dealing with and give themselves some respect for that. I mean, that's the one of the messages when people look back at their childhood and they imagine their own kid going through it. The message of that is not to make you depressed about how bad it was. It's to make you appreciate your own heroic perseverance in coming through that. An analogy that I like to make is that for my patients who came through what we call adverse childhood experiences or ACEs, that it was for them like getting parachuted into the middle of the Himalayas as a toddler. Through no fault of their own, they find themselves in this very difficult environment, and they somehow, they made it out of there. They survived it, and they need to respect the little kid who accomplished that. And when you can internalize that self-respect and that recognition of, like I say, your own heroic perseverance, that makes a huge difference. People finally can see themselves more accurately than they ever have before, and it gives them a certain amount of pride, which then plays out positively in many other areas of life. They're able to take more time for themselves instead of being focused on everybody else in their world and solving their problems. They can say, you know what, I'm going to put myself on the list of people I'm taking care of. Just, maybe once a week, but I'm going to do it. And that makes a big difference. If there are toxic people still in their life, they can set some boundaries that are going to keep that toxicity from harming them. So it begins to have, that gaining that well-deserved, well-earned self-respect begins to have positive ripple effects um, in other places in their life, which, raises their mental health significantly.
So it's been said that different emotions can manifest themselves in certain parts of the body. You can correct me if I'm wrong on some of these things, but for instance, like the liver might be where anger manifests. And then, there's certain areas in muscle groups that manifest different ways with different emotions. So, what are your thoughts on that? And so if somebody does have toxic people, toxic whatever in their lives, what are some of the most common symptoms that you've seen with that?
It's one of the mysteries of this form of illness is that we can't always predict. In fact, most of the time we can't predict where it's going to manifest in your body. You take two people who seem to have more or less the same kinds of stress issues going on, and one of them gets migraines, another one gets fibromyalgia, another one gets chronic fatigue, another one gets back pain. And as a physician, I'm going, I don't know why it's going one place or another. But if I can trace it all back to the same kinds of roots, then it doesn't matter too much where in the body it's going, because the source is going to be very similar. And I'm glad you mentioned the emotions. The That's probably the single most difficult area to diagnose. That and I missed this when I was, back in my beginner days, a lot, that how much emotion people could have and you would never know it on the outside. That a lot of my patients are like dormant volcanoes on the outside with boiling magma on the inside. And, sometimes that anger will come out, it'll get triggered and somebody will have just an outburst of rage for seemingly no reason. And they'll be wondering, where did that come from? And it's because they've got that boiling magma in there all the time. And it comes from having been mistreated, usually as a kid. And they've learned as children, in order to survive those environments, they learned how to take those emotions and stuff them. And they get very good at it because they're doing it for years and starting when they're a kid. And part of the treatment is to help people connect with that. And that goes back to that same exercise of imagining a child you care about growing up as you did. And a lot of my patients are going to start feeling that anger when they imagine watching that kid have to cope with that. And that's critically important, because once you can start feeling those emotions again, you can start putting them into words. You can write about them. A very helpful exercise for many of my patients is to write a letter to the parent or parents who mistreated them, not to mail it, just to write it, to put those emotions, good and bad. A lot of times we still have positive feelings towards our parents, but negative ones right alongside that. They both deserve to be heard. So I have patients put them all down, good and bad, into that unmailed letter. And that makes a big difference. You put emotions into words, they don't need to be expressed via your body. It's usually anger, but it can also be, I've seen in other patients, fear, shame, grief, guilt. Um, all of those, have been out there causing symptoms.
Hey, it makes me think of like, I've been around kids, I mean, kids and adults that just have all these like seizure episodes that no one can figure out, or passing out, or dizziness, or, something that you're like, oh my goodness, like this is life threatening. And they can't find anything wrong. I mean, that's the perfect title for your book. They just can't, and no one knows what it is, and they just live with this stuff with no fix, and they're like, oh, this is just how it is. And then one day it's like they move out of the house and it's all gone. you know I mean, This stuff is just really fascinating.
Yeah, yeah, and that goes way back. I mean, there is you know, to the ancient Greek physicians, they knew about this condition. They, it's kind of laughable today, but what they blamed it on, because it usually happened in girls back then, was that the uterus was wandering around inside the body, causing symptoms wherever it went. And we can chuckle at that now, but the treatment often was to, believe it or not, have the young lady who was experiencing these symptoms get married. And what would that do? It would get them out of the house that was toxic for them. You know, it would, and they would get better because the ancient Greek physicians observed, they didn't know why this was happening, but what they observed was when the young ladies got married, they seemed to get better. And, again, this is just ridiculous, but what they attributed that to was, well, now the young ladies are having sex, and when they have sex, that brings the uterus back to where it belongs, and it stops wandering around inside the body and causing these symptoms. But what was really happening was they were getting these young ladies out of a toxic home environment.
Wow, that is absolutely incredible.
Yeah, I don't share that story with too many people because it doesn't put us physicians in a good light. But it was 3,000 years ago. So, um, but it's also it's embarrassing. I mean, this condition was first described that we know of in writing in an Egyptian papyrus from 1800 BC, and the treatment that was recommended in those days basically had what we call placebo value, like a sugar pill. um, but here we are almost 4,000 years later, and most patients are still getting treatments that have no better than placebo value. And that's why my organization exists, is that we now have scientifically validated treatment. We've got clinical trials done to a gold standard of science from all across North America that have documented very good results with all the ideas I'm sharing with you today. It's almost like we discovered insulin, and only, 1 in 5,000 diabetics is getting the treatment. It's really time after 4,000 years that we change this.
I think, and Becky, I think you can relate to this too. You can about tell the patients that are going to do well and the patients that aren't just by their mental state. And so, I think that's why they make us take so much psychology as a prerequisite before we become an athletic trainer or a physical therapist. Is if these people are not in the right headspace to heal their bodies, there is no amount of treatment that you can do to help them heal. And if their body is constantly in fight or flight mode, then it is nearly impossible, and they will not heal near as quickly if they don't believe that they're going to get better, or if they're dealing with something completely outside of there that you know their body is just constantly tensed up and not able to handle.
Yeah, I should mention with regard to competitive athletes that sometimes their drive to compete is not coming from a healthy place. One of the responses that people have when they're children and they're in a difficult environment, is to try to fix everything, to try to be perfect, to try to make everybody happy in that environment, to work really hard, to try to solve problems, and to try to be the best little kids they can be. And that can translate into a drive to be competitive. And in sports, it can be, such a powerful drive to excel, coming from this unhealthy environment, to try to counteract that unhealthy environment, that it drives people to extremes, and that they will try to power through injuries, or sometimes the only thing that uh, is able to put a reasonable limit on how much they're driving themselves is when their body protests. And if that's the reason their body is having symptoms. You're never going to solve it with traditional physical therapy or athletic training methods, because they're being pushed from this unhealthy place to just keep going and going and going. And until you address those emotions, they're not going to get better.
Mhm. So, Dave, if we suspect this is kind of going on with one of our people that we have, first, I want to say, I want to make sure that I listen with non-judgment, like making sure that I don't have a reaction that makes them feel more uncomfortable about their background. But what should I do? Like, let's say I do have a kid that I'm working on, and I kind of, a lot of times we're at rodeos, and so I do get to see the dynamic with the parents and things like that. What what could I do to help that kid? What's one of the first things that I could do to help?
I'll ask them if they're experiencing any stress in their life, just a very general, open-ended question. And again, because none of us has a parallel life to compare, many of them will say, "No, not really." And I'll go a little bit further and say, is there anything that you that's going on that you maybe wish was a little better, or that if it was happening to a kid of your own, you might want it to be changed, and or can you just describe, what kinds of things are happening in your life, or, um, are you finding that you're getting good support from your parents, or are they maybe um, pushing you a little harder in your sport than you would like? Those kinds of general questions. And it can take a little while to figure out what's really going on. I'll always remember one of my patients who, when I asked her about stress going on, she said, "No, not really having any." And this big tear came streaming down her cheek. And I just followed up and said, "Well, why don't you tell me, what your life is like?" And it was nonstop. I mean, she just opened up and told me one thing after another that she was doing, none of which by itself, all these individual things were bad, but the collective weight was just too much for her. Her parents, they wanted the best for her, and every time she achieved a certain level of success, they would raise the bar. So it was like, okay, you've done this much, we're going to have you do this much. And then when she achieved that, we're going to have you do this much. And, one night they sat down with her and they added one more thing. And the next morning she had pain.
Mm,
It was, the one more thing was just the last straw for her.
mm,
And another patient of mine, he was the son of two doctors, very accomplished people, and they just kept raising his bar, and they pushed him into taking an advanced placement calculus class, which was extremely difficult for him, and he hated it. But it took so much of his time to get a decent grade that he had to quit playing varsity tennis, which was the thing he loved most in high school. And he's just in tears over this. So I wrote him a prescription for dropping AP calculus whenever he wanted. I just wrote it right out on a real live prescription paper, because I knew his parents would get the message. And they were annoyed with me, let's put it that way. But that was the right prescription for him.
yeah. And it's a fine line as a parent, like you want your kid to do well and you want to have them, you know, reach their potential and all that. But um I think, it's just you have to be so cognizant of how they're reacting to that. And hopefully I've instilled in my girls, like, yes, I want you to do well, but you know what, if you go out there and fall on your face, that's okay too. That's part of life, and don't think I'm going to love you any less because of that. But it's a very fine line to walk as a parent. And then
Yeah. Yeah.
it, and we have highly competitive people that are listening to this, that have pushed themselves for a long time. And I think, hopefully it'll maybe bring some awareness to, where did that drive come from? Did it come from a healthy place or not?
Yeah, it's something I learned from my patients about raising my own kids. I mean, first of all, that parenting is such a difficult job. None of us does it perfectly. But I did realize that when my kids would leave the home for the day, I mean, they are constantly confronted with their shortcomings, whether it's academics or sports or the arts, or their peers. There's always going to be messages coming that they're falling short in one way or another. And when they get home, if I just contribute to that, then they've got no safe space that they can go to. So it was hard for me being all day long at work, a very detail oriented person, and having achieved some success in my profession from being detail oriented, to kind of dial that back when I get home and with my kids, and try to just notice when they do something well, and realize when they don't do something well that they probably are already well aware of that, and they don't need me to pile on. My younger son, for example, his room looked like a tornado hit it. I mean, you could barely see the carpet on his floor for all the junk that was all over the place. But I just let that slide. I don't think a lot of parents would, because it was just, you couldn't even open the door. There was so much junk on there. But I just let it slide, because the rest of his life, he had it really well together. He was an outstanding athlete and good in his academics. And, I just said, okay, if that's the way you want to live.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that you just described my youngest daughter's room. And she's so hard on herself, like she pushes herself. So I really, yeah, I let her room slide. I let a lot of things slide, maybe more than I should, but um because she pushes herself so much, I don't feel like I need to contribute to that.
Yeah, and that's what I found too, is that my kids, when I just kind of shifted to just noted, letting them know that I noticed when they did something well, not a big jumping up and down big deal about it, but just letting them know I was aware. And then, when they did mess up, I would more often than not just point out how I had messed up in a similar way when I was their age, and just let it go at that, because they already knew. I mean, my older son got half a dozen speeding tickets, which, scared the heck out of me. But, I just kind of shared with them the statistics about cause of death for teenage boys, and, let it go at that. I didn't ground him or take his car away, or I just kind of let him know I noticed that too. But if I could have a good ratio of noticing the good things versus a smaller number of noticing the not so good things, I think that contributed to their motivation in a healthy way.
Yeah. I think those are all great points. Can you say again the website that people can go to?
Yeah, symptomatic.me. Our nonprofit has this, long multi-syllable name that nobody can remember. So we came up with symptomatic.me as a user-friendly way to invite people in.
One of the things that I think has been missed in the world is teaching people just how to deal with stress. I mean, I think it just, in today's world with expectations and how fast everything is and how stuff just piles on and the ways of the world in general, the stress will just keep piling on you and keep piling on you, and people don't know how to handle it. And it's not like all stress. I'm not saying that if you have stress in your life, it's all bad. I mean, some stress and
That's
pressure,
right.
as long as it is coming from a healthy place, it it'll make you stronger, it'll make you better, just like lifting weights. But the other way, I mean, it's just like an animal when you're training horses. If you go out there and whip on them every single day and you just walk out and kick them or whatever, and then that's what they come to expect, that some of these things are not any different. That's what your brain will rewire itself to expect when you're experiencing this stress and pain and all of those things.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And one of the best ways is if you can carve out that regular time for yourself for an activity that has no purpose but your own joy. I mean, everybody needs that. It's an essential human skill to be able to do that. Many of my patients who grew up in difficult home situations, they were so focused on what was going on around them that they never learned how to play as kids. One of my patients was actually a young lady, as a young lady, was a champion athlete, but she had to do her sport practice before school, after school, on weekends, starting at age 4. And
Mm.
she never really got to be a child. She never really got to play. So when I met her, she was 32 years old. She was in the emergency room all night for a sudden attack of abdominal pain that seemed to have no cause. And I talked to her about her lifestyle, and it was nonstop. She was working full time. Her husband was working full time. She had 2 daughters. She was coaching in her previous sport. She was coaching other people's kids. She was on the athletic club board of directors. She was driving kids to out-of-state competitions. I asked her, "What do you do for fun?" And she just kind of didn't really, come up with anything. She said, well, maybe I go to the movies every other month with my husband, but that was pretty much it. So um, what her prescription was to take an afternoon a week, which her husband was very supportive, fortunately, to just do something for herself. And she looked at me as like, what am I going to do? Because she didn't know. She, didn't have something fun that she knew how to do. But she ended up going for walks in a park, and that wasn't enough by itself to completely alleviate her pain. But while she was walking, she was thinking. And after 6 weeks, she hit on the idea of taking piano lessons, which, she'd never done anything musical before, but she absolutely loved it. And that was when her pain went away. So,
Mm.
we all need that. I mean, everybody needs that time where you just tell the rest of the world to go take a hike, and I'm going to do something for me. You're just putting yourself on the list of people you take care of. Brings the stress level way down.
Mhm.
Absolutely. I mean, I feel less stressed just thinking about it. I mean, and that's what roping and things like that have always been for me, is a release from everything else that's going on in my life. I mean, I know that I'm the most happy when I'm out in the roping pen or training horses and things like that. And that's why Becky and I work so hard to help people get out of pain so that they can go do that thing. And it's like, if that one thing gets taken away from you, well, everything else declines in a hurry. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're making me curious about whether some of this might apply to horses as well. That if a horse has been traumatized, it may get triggered by, certain things that they associate with the trauma, whether it's a peace attack or whatever. And some, the horses obviously have got brains. Consequently, they have feelings, and, some of these same notions may carry over. I whenever I see a cutting horse in action, those horses have got a lot of mental capacity. Let's put it that way. And if they've got mental capacity, they can probably be influenced by some of these same ideas we're talking about.
Well, that's
Yeah.
a very accurate observation. I mean, they're very intelligent animals. They can sense emotions probably sharper than any other animal out there. I mean, you're right. Their brains are highly developed in that way, and they can always tell when we're having an off day too. I mean, if we're angry and everything else like that, like they know. Or if we're sad, they know. I mean, there's been multiple times that you can tell, when you're a certain type of way, your horse is that way as well. And I'm sure Becky and I can tell stories for hours, and everybody else too, of a time that you've been sad and your horse came to just comfort you when you walked out there, or, if you were angry and then your horse just was skittish and didn't want to do his job either because he was playing off of your emotions so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. My daughter-in-law's family had a guest ranch in the Western Slope in Colorado, and every time I'd go out there, I'd be on a different horse, and they all had their personalities, and if you've got a personality, you've clearly got a mind and emotions.
Yeah. And one thing that as I went through adulthood and then became a mother, and it was interesting to me because so many of my friends were like, well, I can't believe that you still ride. I can't believe that you still compete and do those kinds of things. And I always told them, I said, well, it's really the only thing that I do for me. And I know there's a lot of people out there listening that are in the same boat. And I didn't really know for sure maybe why I always did that for me, but I knew that I was a whole lot grumpier when I didn't get my time on my horse. And so, horses can be so very therapeutic for us, and maybe we don't always realize it, but yeah, that's our goal, is to help people that's the one thing that they do for them, and then if they have terrible intractable pain because of one reason or another and they can't ride, what that does to their mental health can be very devastating. And so I sure appreciate you joining us today and shedding some light on the power of the mind over the body, and just exactly how that can manifest itself, and in so many ways that we don't even realize. So thank you so much, Dr. David Clarke. Again, if you feel like this stuff really hit home with you and you're wondering if this can be part of your problem, go to symptomatic.me and do their questionnaire, and there's lots of good resources on there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Becky and Destry, for bringing this message to your community. I really appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Thank you. We really appreciate it. So, all right, I'll close this out, and thank you all for listening, and definitely a huge thank you to Dr. David Clarke. It is an honor to have you on here, and as always, let your health be the pivot point to your success.